Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Never get sick of saying that. You know, in our series Grand Plans, we've looked at some of the finest ships ever designed. We are lucky enough to have access to a beautiful archive of really incredible ship blueprints and plans, but there is one towering name that we haven't yet looked at that I think is honestly almost criminal that we haven't looked at this ship yet, so today I'm here to rectify that mistake. It's hard to think of ships that are more revolutionary and boundary pushing than France's SS Normandie. The ship's come under some criticism of late, people saying it wasn't really that big of a deal, but the truth is it really was. It was a combination of a lot of different technologies from different ships that had been tested and proven over time. That is true. But you can't deny that looking at the thing and comparing it with the ships that had come just before it and some that were around at the same time, she was a huge step into the future. There are a lot of things about this ship's design that still kind of blow my mind, and I'm sure they will blow yours too if you're not already familiar with Normandie. So buckle up, because on today's episode of Grand Plans, we're diving in and taking a look at the spectacular, magnificent SS Normandie. So we have this really beautiful longitudinal plan. This is an elevation showing Normandie's starboard side. Now, the thing about Normandie is that a lot of the magic is happening on the inside of the ship. So in a future episode, we'll probably look at some deck plans and see exactly what's going on. But there's enough going on the outside of this ship to warrant talking about it. So let's have a quick fly around, as usual, from the front, work our way to the back, and learn just why Normandie was such a huge step in the right direction. So starting off here at the very bow of the ship, you can see that the prow, which is the very front, and the stem where it curves down there has a pretty unique shape. So it's curved above the waterline, and then it essentially goes dead straight as it hits the waterline and then flares out in a bulbous bow. Now this hull shape was tested ad nauseam in the testing tanks at the French shipyard in Saint-Nazaire. And the truth is that the hull was a pretty revolutionary shape. She was extremely flared towards the bow section above the waterline, which would give her really good qualities and handling in rough weather. But the bulbous bow is something that had been tested and proven on later ships in the 1920s, like the Bremen, the Europa, but even before then on battleships. You know, some of those early 20th century US battleships like the Arizona and so on, they had a fairly similar bow shape. And what they realized was obviously that the bulbous bow was giving them some pretty substantial fuel economy savings. We've talked a little bit about how the bulbous bow works on the channel before, so I won't go too much into it, but I will say that the combination of a flared bow and a straight stem, for the French line at least, was a really good compromise in terms of the handling through rough weather, that she wasn't going to pitch too much. She wasn't going to, be blown out of the water or coming head onto huge waves too much. She'd ride fairly naturally. So every part of the ship's hull, every curve had a really important role to play, and it was very deliberate. What's really interesting about this forward end of this ship, though, is how clean it is. You can see that there's really not a lot above the nameplate there. You see Normandie, and then above that there is the promenade deck. And the forecastle, the very bow deck of the ship, is plated over with what's called a whaleback deck. And this serves a couple of really important roles. Primarily, it's designed to ship big waves over the nose of the ship, and then you've got this monumental breakwater that essentially deflects the waves either side of the superstructure behind it. Now, other ships had breakwaters like this. This wasn't revolutionary, but having a whaleback deck on the bow that completely encases the forecastle means that water really can't accumulate on the bow of the ship. Now, we spoke to Stephen Payne, who's a proper naval architect and engineer, and he was explaining that the Queen Mary, which was in many ways the competitor to Normandie, didn't really have anything like this. And she had a well deck, which was the forecastle is there, then it steps down into another little deck, and then it comes up again at the superstructure. If she copped a big wave over the bow, the huge volume of water that was taken on, even just for a moment, as it drained away, we're talking, hundreds of tons. And so this would, for a moment, cause the ship to lose her stability, because there would be this added weight up top. So the ship could really roll because she was shipping huge waves over the bow, which is obviously extremely unpleasant for passengers. So Normandie's designers went out of their way to make sure that, Normandy wouldn't be a big roller, because they had experienced this with other French ships before that were notoriously bad. So the Normandy, they're obviously taking big steps to keep the ship stable. One of the other things that's interesting about this, though, is that, this is kind of what cruise ships look like now. All of the anchor handling equipment, you can actually just see it here to the right of the nameplate. You can see marked in things like, capstans and, mooring bits and bollards and all these things that would otherwise be cluttering the upper deck. On the Normandy, they're covered. And that is really aesthetically quite pretty, because as much as nerds like me enjoy seeing big bits of ship machinery cluttering the decks, do Normandy's passengers really need to see that? Not necessarily. So ships of Normandy's vintage are really going above and beyond to begin to take considerations for the exterior of the vessel, what it looks like with all this clutter. They're modernizing, they're streamlining. This is right in the era of Art Deco and that real effort to streamline things. You think of Norman Bell Geddes' design for a future ocean liner, and you think of some of those beautiful train designs that were coming out of that era. And it's all about getting rid of excess, getting rid of clunky things that sit out the front. One of the other interesting things that's kind of cool that you can see about Normandy is that there's a few different mooring positions. You've got one up here on deck A. We can see cutouts in the hull where the bits are, the fair leads, all the stuff that would secure Normandy to the dock. And then there's actually another position down here at deck B, or Pont B, where you can see those capstans marked in and all these different bits and pieces for mooring the ship. It's all contained within the hull. So it's also protected from the elements. So for the crew actually having to moor the ship in winter in New York, I'm sure they would have really appreciated this. We've just moved along to Normandy's first funnel and the bridge and the forward superstructure. And so, this is, again, where Normandy is really beginning to differentiate herself from ships that had come before. Liners like Bremen and Europa had really set a new standard for the visual aesthetic of what an ocean liner should look like. They had these beautifully curved superstructures that were quite elegant, quite deco, but also extremely functional. They weren't blocky, they weren't, drag inducing. They would deflect waves and presumably even give a little boost to speed, because there would be less wind resistance. So Normandy took that to the nth degree and had all of her forward decks curving extremely dramatically. And so you can kind of see that here. But we're also starting to see some interesting bits of equipment installed on this ship. In the past, all they had to rely on were for navigation and communication and things like that were the Marconi wireless. Systems that had been in practice, and in use by this point for 20, 30 years. And so by the time Normandy comes along, there were new systems of navigating, direction finding, triangulation, and things like that. So she's installed with these big direction finding loops. You can see one right here on the forward end of the bridge to help with her navigation, to pinpoint her location, and make it a lot easier on the approach into New York to figure out exactly where she is by triangulating her position, comparing signal frequencies from stations ashore with Normandy's own position to, essentially navigate and guide themselves in as accurately as possible. Because before then, it was a dicey proposition, even into the early 20s, it was fairly difficult to navigate these things, especially in fog. And so many of them ran aground over, on the east coast of the US. So this is a huge step forward. If we just come down a little bit, you can actually see there's a series of big double doors that line the hull. They're all for different things. There's a first class entranceway here, but the really interesting one is down here. It says embarquement aux autos, basically embarkation for cars. So Normandy had a garage, and you could drive your car on board. I mean, how cool is that? They don't do that anymore. This is kind of this, again, big step into the future. You can just take your car across the Atlantic, no worries. It's really cool. It's a shame they don't do that on ships anymore. But there was a gangway that could be led from the pier, put your car on, take your car off, and you would go through these doors. There was one on the port side, there was one on the other side as well. Just another thing here, you can see the cargo handling equipment is really heavily reduced to just a pair of cranes, on ships from even not that long before, like Ile-de-France and other ships like that. From ships not that long before Normandie's construction, there were winches and derricks and all these booms, all this stuff, tackle and everything, just like absolutely cluttering the forward end of the ship. Big masts, all this stuff was needed, and it's just the way they had built ships forever, basically. But by the time Normandie comes along, they have the brilliant idea of just fitting electric cranes, just a pair of them. They're big enough that they can swing over and, pick bits of cargo up and load them in through the hatch here. Normandy isn't, leaning into the cargo handling that ships, 20 years or even 10 years might have done. She's, it's almost really an afterthought, and it's evident because, she's just got a pair of cranes here, and that's kind of it, Normandy is doing the job of what 2 or 3 smaller, lesser ships would have done. This is the mentality. You build a big enough ship that has enough space for enough people that can go quickly enough and efficiently enough to make up for, the cost and maintenance of having to run 3 smaller ships. So it's an equation. And so everything goes into it. Normandie is a big, big, big ship. She's over 1,000 feet long. She's up in the region of like 80,000 tons. So she's a really decently sized liner for this age. And so, she's making most of her money, all of her money almost really, from passenger berthing, from first, second and third class. But there was a huge focus on the amenities for first class, and rather famously, the other classes were kind of not as, shall we say, well considered in many ways. But we'll come to that later on. So we've just moved back to between the first and the second funnel. And again, one of the things that's really obvious here is just how much deck space there is. I mean, a lot of the stuff that would otherwise be cluttering the upper decks has been encased in deck houses, and this is how they build ships today. There are all these fans and ventilation equipment and air conditioning and everything. That on other ships that were older had cluttered the decks. And in Normandie's case, they've put them in these really rather impressive deck house bases for the funnels. You can tell that there are fans and vents and things in there because there are these huge grill covers that wrap around the front. That's really like the only clue that there's all this stuff in there. The funnels are enormous, as you can tell. But what's really cool is that they're illuminated by these lights. They had spotlights shining up at the funnels, which was a thing that became more popular to do through the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. Not so much the 40s, because, wartime, ships were trying to darken themselves out so as not to be destroyed. But, in peacetime, shining lights on funnels made the ships look very, very impressive at nighttime. And it's kind of a little counterintuitive to think that before then, I guess no one had really thought to do it. And so ships like, Lusitania and Mauritania and Titanic, which had these spectacular towering funnels at nighttime, they weren't illuminated, unlike what you might think from watching films. So, this is all about, showing off your ship. It's all now marketing. It's all really leaning into, look how big and beautiful this ship looks in all conditions. Why don't you buy a ticket? And it's, a great bit of PR. But also, it's the age, right? It's the late 20s, the early 30s. It's glitz, it's glamour, it's lights, it's showtime. And Normandie is all about glitz and glamour. She's got all these big nestled lifeboats which have propellers. They're probably not motorized. They're probably using Fleming gear or something like that, which is essentially, instead of rowing, passengers would, turn a crank or something like that, which would provide inertia and, power for a propeller or a pair of propellers. But she does have a pair of these powered motorboats. You can just see one right here. And these are big boats. I mean, this is, the size of a private yacht, right? So, it really shows the scale, I guess, of ships the size of Normandy when their boats and their lifeboats and things are like the size of, your modern day standard sailing boat, sailing yacht. It's pretty impressive. Aquitania back in 1914 had powered boats, so this wasn't necessarily a revolutionary thing, but it's still really cool seeing them. I don't know how confident I would be standing underneath those things swung overhead when they weigh a couple of tons. Normandy also used gravity davits. So this is the age of the gravity davit becoming the thing for maritime safety. Huge improvement over what had come before. The davit essentially is just dropped with gravity, goes over the side, lowers the boat. It's a big step forward. Of course, all the, the lowering equipment by this point is motorized. So, it's not people heaving on lines or anything like that. So, big step forward in terms of safety as well, just for getting boats away. Of course, one of the things that you can see wrapping around the superstructure is the beautiful enclosed promenade deck. You can see all these big windows up here on the upper promenade. So we've talked about promenades before, but it still, makes me sad that the enclosed promenade has disappeared from ships. But back in the day, Normandy's enclosed promenade was a beautiful big space where you could basically do a full wraparound walk around the ship in first class. And there are all the main public spaces leading off it. This would have been a real selling point, because it means in really tough Atlantic weather, in the storms, in the rain, in the wind, there's always a place to lie down and read a book, which is really quite cool. You can also see here that there is a absolute battery of boarding doors for first class. So there's the set here, I think this is B deck off the top of my head, and then down here you can see more. Now this is just all for first class. So this is the main boarding entrance. And so it's right in the heart of the ship, and you can really tell that this is the amount of importance put onto first class is beginning to show, because they've got 4 big doors and they're all right in the middle of the ship. In second and third class, there's a couple of doors and they're all the way back there. So now back here at the base of the third funnel, and you can see some of those big ventilator grills that we were talking about earlier. So there's a lot of plant and equipment and things hidden behind here. What's really interesting about the third funnel is that it has an old style tri-bell whistle. These are really similar to the ones that were mounted on ships like, I hate to say it, but Olympic and Titanic and Lusitania. Very old fashioned. These have actually been preserved, I think, and they still blow steam through them. They still work just fine, which is really cool. Presumably, this was a backup to what Normandie mounted on her first funnel, which was one of the, or I think a set of Typhon horns. Now, Typhon horns, they're called whistles, but they probably have more in common with a horn, were, big units that could be heard out to, I think, something like 9 or 10 miles. And Queen Mary actually mounted a very similar pair. So they're a pretty impressive piece of kit, but that would be the main voice of the Normandie, I'd imagine. And I don't know if these steam whistles served as like a auxiliary, like a foghorn or maybe something like that, but it's really funny as well to have them mounted on the reverse side of the third funnel. It's kind of like a weird place to put them. Normandie was known as the Ship of Light, and mainly it's because her first class interiors were absolutely covered in light fittings of all different sorts. All the cut crystal chandeliers and towering columns of light were basically everywhere. But she also employed some pretty impressive tall windows. So you can see these lining the boat deck here. There's a whole battery of these things that allow tons of natural light into, all these beautiful first class rooms that were back here. And so, again, this is very much of the age, but it's all about light. It's all about lightness. And, Normandie's first class rooms, when you look at pictures of them from the inside, you really get a sense of, a real sense of lightness, of airiness. And it's all because of this, clever playing with space. Normandie used a lot of raised ceilings, a lot of lowered decks, a lot of raised decks to create, artificial gaps and spaces where they would be able to place these big rooms with huge ceiling heights. So her first class spaces deep in the, in the center line of the ship, like the first class smoking room, like the first class dining saloon, were unbelievably tall, 3 stories tall, at least 4 stories. Some of the other rooms, like towards the after end of the ship here, some of the bars and things like that still had extremely impressive ceilings, and so they've made absolutely the most of it by providing them with these floor-to-ceiling windows, which is really, really spectacular, and the effect is beautiful. We were talking about the doors and boarding points and things like that, so this is where we start to see some of the boarding points for the other classes. So second class, very cleverly, French line was calling tourist class. You can see here that there's a boarding point for tourists. There's another one here. There's 2 of them. So, this is where your second class would be coming in. And then way down the bottom, right down here, below the tourist class, you have third class boarding point at D-deck. So, yeah, way down the back of the ship, way down at the bottom. And then just forward of it, you have crew boarding. So this is for personnel. Not exactly a glamorous boarding point, but, at least you're on one of the finest ships afloat, I guess, so you can't complain too much. It's really great looking at the stern like this because you get this sensation of, again, openness. There's so much open deck space. And again, the stern has got an enclosed mooring deck where all that equipment, all that heavy stuff is housed. There's even an extra anchor back here. You can actually just see it here with the pipe that would have led up into the mooring deck. And that's because, where Normandie was expected to operate, shallow anchorages and things like that off France, it might be that she, could need to stand to and wait her turn to berth, or might need to, wait up a while. So being able to secure the ship forward and aft, having anchors that can actually hold her in place, it's very important because you absolutely do not want 1,000+ foot long ocean liner breaking loose or swinging wildly out of control or anything like that. But I think what's really cool here is that there's actually a folding platform you can see just here marked out that presumably would have been used during the mooring process, or maybe even for depth sounding or something like that. And they still have those on cruise ships today, where you will see somebody with a walkie-talkie on one of these folded out platforms, basically supervising the mooring process. You could have an officer or a senior sailor or somebody like that on the platform, communicating with the people who are running operating the heavy steam equipment that is warping Normandie, bringing her closer or further away from the dock. It's a very important job, and so it relies on somebody actually being able to see what's going on. So having a platform that can come out is extremely useful. So there was one there. There was actually also secretly one forward at the bow. You can see it right here. So again, really, really clever stuff, and it's what is the norm today on cruise ships. So, again, this ship is really, really forward thinking. She was designed largely by a Russian emigre to France named Vladimir Yorkovich, and he was a really forward thinking guy. It's just fascinating seeing the shape, the form of Normandie, because no other ship had been built prior to this point that looked anything like this. It's easy to take for granted now. And, the fact that Normandie was such a revolution is reflected in the fact that Cunard Line, who were a big competitor to French Line, or CGT, who operated and built Normandie, Cunard Line were a little bit more reserved in the way that they built ships. And Queen Mary, which was built around the same time as Normandie, was a lot more old-fashioned from the outside. It was just more in the tradition of how ships had always been built. And by the time they built her running mate, Queen Elizabeth, not too long after, the game had changed, thanks to ships like Normandie. And so you see on Queen Elizabeth a lot of design cues from Normandie, the rounded superstructure. You see the raked bow. You see the deck houses with the big vents. Queen Elizabeth, in many ways, from the outside, has more in common with Normandie than Queen Mary. And, it sets the trend. And this is just how ships are built from then on. And so it's really cool getting to see it from the outside here. Again, most of the really interesting, groundbreaking stuff is more so happening on the inside of the ship, where we're talking about decks being raised, these huge roofs being put into place. It's pretty interesting stuff. So we'll probably do that in part 2. Not too long after they built Normandie, they would be welding ships instead of riveting them. So, this is about as big as you can make riveted ships. This is the very pinnacle of, building ships in a tradition that had started back in the 1800s, because then things would change with the introduction of, welding and things like that in the 40s and 50s. So, well done, French Line. Really, really spectacular ship. She was obviously a big step forward. You can tell just from looking at it that there is a lot here that was unique, that was, a step in the right direction. And, I don't understand why people criticize Normandie so much in the ocean liner community. There are a lot of people who say that the, revolutionary nature of her design is kind of overblown, which I understand. There is a lot of hyperbole written around ships like Normandie, but, you know, it's kind of hard to dismiss the fact that other shipping lines did end up, you know, taking some design cues at least from at least the exterior of the ship. The interior is a whole other story that we'll probably talk about next time. But yeah, it was pretty spectacular, but a little bit too much maybe like a gallery, which I think made some people feel uncomfortable. But anyway, that is a bit of a primer on the design of Normandie. We're going to be going into the real details of this ship in a near future video. We're going to be telling the story of her design, her construction, and her career. She's an absolute favorite. You know, I'd like to say they don't build ships like this anymore, and in many ways they don't, but there are a lot of, you know, things taken from ships like Normandie that are still present on ship designs today, and it's thanks to pioneering efforts like Normandie that mean that we, you know, get to enjoy, the ships that we do now. So what do you think about the Normandie? Was there a detail that you would have liked me to cover that I might have missed? Do you think the ship is overblown and wasn't really that revolutionary? Let me know in the comments. If there's another ship you'd like me to look at, let me know in the comments below and I'll check the archive and see if we've got plans of it. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again.